My daughter-in-law set a plate of bread down in the center of the table and said, without looking at me, "We'll need you to sign the quitclaim deed by Friday. The mortgage company needs both signatures." I was sitting in what used to be my dining room. The wallpaper I'd chosen 31 years ago, a pale cream with small blue flowers, had been painted over. Beige, the kind of beige that has no opinion about anything. I said, "I'm sorry." She sat down across from me, folded her hands, and said it again, slower this time, as if I were hard of hearing instead of hard of believing. My son was at the head of the table. He was looking at his phone. I picked up my coffee cup. I set it back down. And I thought, I know exactly what a quitclaim deed is, sweetheart. I handled the paperwork when your father-in-law and I bought this house. I was the one who filed it at the county clerk's office. I was 29 years old, and I triple-checked every line, because we had scrimped for 4 years for that down payment, and I was not going to let a clerical error take it from us. But I didn't say any of that. I said, "Let me think about it." And I drove home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time, not crying, just sitting, thinking about how a person gets from there to here. My name is Irene. I'm 71 years old. I live in the same town in central Ohio where I was born, where I raised my children, where I buried my husband 9 years ago. I worked as a bookkeeper for 23 years. I know how numbers work. I know how paperwork works. I know how paperwork works. I know how to read a document before I sign it. My husband Gene died in the spring. He was 64, which is not old enough. He had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while I was at the grocery store, and by the time I got home the ambulance was already in the driveway. That is the kind of thing that rearranges everything, not just the practical things. Though those were considerable, the accounts, the pension, learning to do the taxes alone. It rearranges the inside of you, who you were as part of a pair, and who you are now as a single person. Those are 2 different people, and figuring out the second one takes longer than anyone tells you. My son, I'll call him by what I've always called him, my boy, though he is 43 years old and has not been a boy in a very long time, came to stay with me for 2 weeks after the funeral. His wife came for the first few days and then went back to manage things at home, which I understood. They have 2 daughters. They have a life. What I didn't fully understand, not yet, was what they wanted from mine. Jean and I had built things carefully. That was the word we always used, carefully. We didn't take vacations we couldn't afford. We paid off the mortgage on our house in 22 years instead of 30. We had a small investment account, nothing dramatic. Jean had a pension from the plant, and I had a 401k from the firm I worked for. When he died, I inherited what we'd saved together. It wasn't a fortune, but it was security. It was the result of decades of careful choices made by 2 people who understood that nobody was going to hand them anything. The house was mine outright. That matters. I want you to understand that from the beginning, the house was mine, free and clear, and it had been appraised at $260,000, which in central Ohio is a solid house. It's the house where my children grew up. It's where we put up the Christmas tree every year until the kids stopped coming home for Christmas, which happened gradually and then suddenly, the way those things do. My son and his wife had bought a place of their own 7 years ago, a bigger house in a better school district, which I helped them with. I gave them $40,000 toward the down payment. I want to be clear about that too. I gave it, not a loan, a gift, because that's what parents do when they can, and I could, and I wanted to. I did not expect anything in return. That's not why you help your children. But I also did not expect what came next. It started small, the way these things always do. A few months after the funeral, my son called and said they were having some trouble with cash flow. His wife had gone back to work part-time after their second daughter was born, and the expenses had gotten ahead of them. Could I help with a few months of their mortgage payments, just while they restructured things? I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was grieving too in his own way, and I thought, this is what the money is for. This is why Jean and I saved. 3 months became 5. 5 became 8. I didn't say anything. I didn't keep a ledger. I told myself I was a mother, and this is what mothers do. Then there was the car. My daughter-in-law's car needed a transmission, and they were upside down on the loan, and could I, just this once, help cover the gap? $3,200, I wrote the check, then school tuition for my older granddaughter. A good private kindergarten, they said. The public school in their district had had some problems. Could I contribute to the tuition just for 1 year? It was $11,000 a year. I said I would cover half. I did the math at some point, not because I'm suspicious by nature, but because I'm a bookkeeper by training, and the numbers were there, and I have never in my life been able to ignore a column that doesn't add up. In 18 months, I had given or lent, and I was not entirely sure which it was, somewhere close to $60,000, on top of the original $100,000. I sat with that number for a while. Then I put the notepad away, and I didn't look at it again. Because some things you know, but you're not ready to know, and I had just lost my husband, and I was tired, and my son was my son, and I loved him. There is a particular quality to the weeks before you finally see something clearly. I notice it in hindsight now, the way you see the shape of a season once it's ended. There were signs I wasn't reading or was reading wrong, or was choosing not to read at all. My daughter-in-law started coming to Sunday dinners. I cooked. I always cooked. She started bringing Tupperware, and she'd asked to take leftovers home. I was glad to give them. Then she started asking, in a casual way, what I was planning to do with certain things. The good china, was I planning to keep all of it? Jean's tools in the garage, my son could use those if I wasn't going to. The upright piano in the living room that I'd had since I was 34 years old and still played most mornings, would I consider letting the girls have it? They were interested in music. I gave away the tools. I boxed up half the china. I did not give away the piano. I should have paid more attention to what I did keep and why, but I wasn't thinking about it that way yet. I was thinking, I'm their grandmother. Of course I want to give them things. The shift, the real one, the one I can point to now, was the afternoon my daughter-in-law came over alone. My son was at work. She had a yellow legal pad, which I remember specifically, because I use yellow legal pads, and it felt strange to see her sitting at my kitchen table with one, as if she prepared for this meeting. She talked for about 20 minutes about their financial situation. It was more detailed than anything my son had ever shared with me. Interest rates, the balloon payment coming due, the equity they had, or didn't have, in their house. She used the word restructure several times. She was not unkind. She was efficient. At the end, she said, we've been looking into options, and one thing that could really help us is if you added the house to a joint tenancy arrangement. It would simplify things down the line and let us access some of the equity if we needed to. I knew what that meant. I am 71 years old, and I know what a joint tenancy means. It means your name goes on the deed. It means my house becomes, in part, your house. It means if something happens to me, which at 71 is not an abstraction, there are legal complications I am not prepared to introduce into my life. I said, I'll think about it. She nodded and wrote something on her legal pad. 3 weeks later was the dinner where she mentioned the quitclaim deed. I want to tell you about my daughter, because she is part of this story, even though she doesn't appear until later. Her name is Beverly. She lives in Portland, Oregon, where she has lived for 17 years. She is 46. She is a physical therapist. She is nobody's idea of a dramatic person. She calls me every Sunday morning. She came home for 2 weeks after Jean died, and cleaned the entire house without being asked, and sat with me at night when I couldn't sleep, and we watched old episodes of cooking shows until 3 in the morning. She has never once asked me for money. I called her the night after the quitclaim conversation. I sat in my kitchen with a glass of water and I told her everything, going back to the beginning, the payments, the car, the tuition, the china, the legal pad. She was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then she said, "Mom, you know you don't have to do any of this." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" And that question stayed with me longer than anything else she said that night, because the honest answer was, I wasn't sure. I had been a wife and a mother for so long that I wasn't entirely certain where those roles ended and where I began. Gene had always been the one who said no, not harshly, but clearly. He had a way of drawing a line without making a scene, and after he died, I realized I had been leaning on that line without knowing it. Without him, I didn't know where it was anymore. Beverly said, before we hung up, "Call a lawyer, Mom, not to start a fight, just to understand where you stand." I wrote it on the notepad on my refrigerator. Not call a lawyer, just where you stand. His name was Mr. Hartwell, and he had been practicing estate law in our county for 30 years. He had kind eyes and a very clean desk, and he did not make me feel foolish for not knowing things I didn't know, which I appreciated. I told him the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I had signed anything. I hadn't. The second was whether anything had been put in writing regarding the payments I had made. It hadn't. He explained several things I had suspected but not confirmed. What a quitclaim deed would actually mean for my ownership. What Medicaid estate recovery rules in Ohio could mean if I ever needed long-term care. And, he said gently, at 71, it was not too early to think about that. What would happen to my house in various scenarios if my name was shared on a deed with someone whose finances were, as I had described, complicated. Then he asked me what I wanted. Nobody had asked me that in a while. I had to sit with the question for a moment. I said, I want to keep my house. I want to protect what Gene and I built, and I want to make sure that when I'm gone, things are handled the way I want them handled, not the way other people have decided. He nodded as if that were a completely reasonable thing to want, which it is, and he told me we could accomplish all of it. We met twice more over the following 6 weeks. A revocable living trust was established, with me as the trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. The house went into the trust. My investment accounts were updated with new transfer-on-death designations. I named Beverly as the successor trustee. I named an independent executor for the will we updated. A woman from my church, a retired schoolteacher named Agnes, who has known me for 30 years and has no stake in any of it. I did not name my son. I drove home after the second meeting, and I sat in my car in my driveway again. Same driveway as before. Same house. But something was different. I had walked into a lawyer's office as someone whose house was being discussed at other people's kitchen tables, and I had walked out as someone who had taken care of her own business. It was a Wednesday afternoon in October. The maple in the front yard was completely red. I'd planted it with Jean the first fall we moved in, and it was a twig then, barely standing, and now it was enormous and burning and beautiful. I sat there and looked at it for a long time. Then I went inside, and I made myself a pot of soup. I should tell you about the Friday. The quitclaim deed had a deadline. My daughter-in-law had said Friday, and on Thursday evening my son called. He was not unkind either, not exactly. He said they were under some pressure with the timeline, and could I let them know my decision. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, trying to stay out past curfew. That careful casualness that means the person knows they're asking for something unreasonable. I said, I've decided not to sign. There was a pause. He said, "Mom," I said, "I've spoken with an attorney and I've made arrangements for my estate. The house is in a trust now. It can't be transferred." Another pause. Longer. He said, "You talked to a lawyer without telling us." I said, "It's my house, sweetheart. It's my estate. I don't need to tell you before I make decisions about it." I heard him exhale. Then he said, "I hope you know this is going to make things hard." I said, "What things?" He didn't answer that directly. He said they had counted on this. He said they had made plans. He said, "And this is the part I've thought about the most." He said, "I'm your son." I said, "Yes, you are, and I love you, but I also spent 42 years building something with your father, and I'm not going to sign it away because it would make your cash flow easier." He hung up. Not slammed, just hung up. A click, and then silence. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, and I thought, this is going to be a long winter. It was. They did not come for Thanksgiving. My granddaughters sent me drawings in the mail, which told me that whatever had happened between the adults, their mother had the decency not to cut off the children's relationship with me entirely. I framed the drawings and put them on the refrigerator. I looked at them every morning. Beverly came home for Christmas. We cooked together and watched movies, and she helped me go through some of Jean's things I hadn't been ready to deal with before. We found an old photo album, the cardboard kind from the 70s, and we sat on the floor of the bedroom and looked at every page. Jean at 25, thin and laughing. Me at 23 with terrible hair. My son at 2 years old in a wading pool. Beverly as a newborn, wearing a hat that was too big for her head. "He loved you," Beverly said. "I know," I said. "Both of you." She meant Jean. She meant my son too, somewhere underneath all of it. I knew that. Loving someone and behaving badly toward them are not mutually exclusive. That's one of the harder things about family. In February, my son called. He didn't lead with an apology exactly, but he didn't lead with an accusation either, which felt like progress. He said he wanted to talk. I said he wanted to listen. He came over on a Saturday afternoon. Without his wife, which I noticed, he sat at my kitchen table, the same table where his father sat for 30 years, where he did homework as a child, where we had birthday dinners and arguments and ordinary Tuesday meals that you don't know are important until they're over. He said things had been hard. He said he felt like he'd been drowning and he'd grabbed for whatever was nearby. He didn't quite say he was wrong to grab for me, but he said he knew it hadn't been fair. I gave him coffee. I sat across from him. I didn't tell him about the trust in detail, or the accounts, or any of the specifics, because that's not his information to have. But I said, "I'm not going to leave you with nothing. You are my son, but I'm also not going to give you something now that leaves me with nothing later. And I'm not going to make decisions about what I built with your father based on a deadline someone else set." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dad would have said no right away, wouldn't he? It wasn't really a question." I said, "About 20 seconds in." He almost smiled. It looked like it surprised him. We didn't fix everything that afternoon. I'm not going to tell you we did, because that's not how these things work, and you already know that. But he came in through the front door, and he left through the same front door, and he hugged me on the porch, and it was the hug of a person who is ashamed and doesn't quite know what to do with that yet, which is not nothing, which is somewhere to start from. There are things I understand now that I didn't when Jean was alive, not because he was hiding them from me, but because when you are half of a pair, you don't need to understand the whole equation. He balanced things I didn't think to balance. I deferred to him in ways I didn't even notice until the deferring had nowhere to go. I am not angry at him for it. I am not even angry at myself. But I have had to learn at 71 years old to be the person who says no, to understand that saying no to my child is not the same as abandoning him, to understand that protecting what Jean and I built together is not selfishness. It is faithfulness. to the life we made, to the person I was when I made it. I still play the piano most mornings, hymns mostly, a little Chopin when I'm feeling ambitious. The piano stays where it is. The maple out front lost its leaves in November and looked dead all winter the way maples do, bare and grey and unconvincing. But I've lived in Ohio long enough to know that's not the whole story. You wait. You tend your own house. You do not sign things you haven't tread. In April the leaves came back, small and red-green at first, then fully open, shading the porch the way they have every spring for 37 years. I stood on the porch with my coffee, and I looked at it, and I thought, still here, still mine. I've been thinking lately about what it actually costs to say nothing, not the silence that comes from not knowing what to say. The other kind, the silence that comes from knowing exactly what you think and choosing for years to fold it up and put it somewhere out of sight because it feels easier than the alternative. I did that for a long time. I told myself it was kindness. I told myself it was love. And some of it was, but some of it was also fear. Fear of conflict, fear of losing my son, fear of becoming the kind of mother people talk about at Thanksgiving as the reason everything went wrong. What I've learned, on the other side of all of it, is that silence has a price too. It just gets billed later. Jean would have said no at the kitchen table the first time, calmly and without drama, and my son would have accepted it because that was always how it worked between them. I watched that dynamic for 40 years and somehow didn't understand until Jean was gone that I had been leaning against a door he was holding open. When he died, the door was just a door, and I had to figure out how to hold it myself. That's not a failure. There's just something I didn't know I needed to learn yet. The thing about integrity, the real kind, not the kind people talk about in speeches, is that it usually gets tested when you're already tired. It doesn't wait for you to be rested and ready and certain. It showed up for me when I was a widow in my first year of grief, when I was lonely in ways I didn't have words for, when saying yes felt like the only way to keep my son close. And I said yes for a while, because I was human and I was hurting. But there is something in a person, call it the part that keeps the books, the part that knows when a column doesn't add up, that eventually refuses to be overridden. I sat with those numbers. I sat with that legal pad my daughter-in-law brought to my kitchen table, and something in me said, not this, not the house, not what Jean and I built. I called a lawyer, not out of anger, but out of clarity. That's an important distinction. Anger burns out. Clarity is what you can actually build on. And Beverly, my daughter who never asked me for anything, said 4 words that changed the direction of everything. Do you, though? She didn't solve it for me. She just handed me the question and trusted me to answer it honestly. That's what real love looks like. It doesn't make your decisions for you. It makes sure you're actually the one making them. Irene sitting on that porch in April watching the maple come back. That's where I want to leave this. Not at the hard conversation with my son, not at the lawyer's office, not at the long quiet winter. At the maple. At the ordinary morning with the coffee and the red-green leaves and the house still mine and the ground still solid. You don't get there by being hard. You get there by finally, clearly understanding what belongs to you and deciding that it's worth protecting. That's what I know now. It took me 71 years to learn it properly, but I know it now, and I am not going to forget it.